Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to this important webinar, which is addressing US and European differences to better respond to China. We have a remarkable group of people who I'll introduce in a minute, but just to set the scene, we are mounting this webinar at a time when Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State of the United States, is in the United Kingdom, pushing the need for a united front in dealing with Huawei, talking about trade differences with China and expressing concerns about security. And so it is very timely that as the world confronts unique changes in relations among the United States, Europe and China, which have been exacerbated by COVID-19, that we come together to look at a report that has been produced by a number of leading thinkers on these subjects. This Asia Society webinar is now brought to us at the Asia Scotland Institute. And we will consider these differing transatlantic perceptions to determine what should be done to achieve greater consensus, to deliver a more effective response to unwanted Chinese assertiveness, and to provide context and the framework for discussion. This institute is extremely fortunate to be able to use a recently published report on the subject. The report, dealing with the dragon, China as a transatlantic challenge, is the outgrowth of a symposium that brought together 43 of America and Europe's top China experts to identify areas of common interest and divergence across the Atlantic. Our panel consists of Orville Schell, American writer and academic known for his works on China and key author of the report. He's currently director of the Center on US-China Relations at the Asia Society in New York, and previously served as the Dean of the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. He is joined by Rana Mitter, historian and political scientist, currently professor of the history and politics of modern China, and a director of the University of China Center, a fellow of St. Cross College from Oxford University, specializing in contemporary Chinese politics, government, international relations, society, and culture. He also contributed to the report. Our third panelist is Alison Laskowski. She is a senior fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She previously served as a Foreign Service officer at the US State Department, where she was Special Assistant to Under Secretary of State for Political Affairs, Wendy Sherman, advising her on Asia Pacific and economic issues. She has broad experience working on Northeast Asia, including the US-China relationship, and also served as the State Department's lead on US-China military and security issues with the Department of Defense. So three distinguished panelists to lead us through this discussion, and we are delighted therefore to be able to ask them to start and to perhaps ask Orville Schell to kick us off for this webinar. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Roddy. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I think particularly so at this moment, which I do more and more view as a real inflection point in history. And I think it was a recognition that such a moment was upon us that got our group together to go to Berlin in February, just as the virus was sort of hitting its stride. And we did manage to have a really very interesting and successful meeting with 11 countries, some 40-odd people. And I think what animated the gathering was the long-held dream that never seemed quite to be able to gel into anything that was like an effective action plan between transatlantic allies and indeed other countries that shared liberal democratic forms of governance, that the best policy towards China need not be punitive, but it should be collaborative. And the degree to which countries that did share common values, political systems, a sense of how the world order best functioned, would be able to manage an evolving relationship with China much better if we did so in concert. But that dream, alas, has been something of a retreating horizon. And as you all well know, in Europe, even the Europeans have had trouble getting together. And then along came Trump, who is certainly not renowned for his fine management of allies. So it was with those challenges in mind that we thought it would be good to get together a group of people who cared about this subject to see, what are the trend lines in China vis-a-vis each of our countries? What is the state of sort of political atmosphere in each country towards China? How did each country view China's intentions? And what were the prospects for us actually to weave some more tightly woven fabric of response? Now, what's been so surprising to me since we had our meeting, where I have to say that there was much criticism of my country, the United States, and President Trump, but there also was a great awareness that the challenges being posed by China were much more difficult and much more threatening than they had been in past decades. So what is so striking since then, to me, are the following observations. One, I think the United States has curiously done a poor job and also a quite effective job. It's a tremendous contradiction in sort of rallying countries to a common purpose. On the one hand, it's abused allies, it's ignored allies, it's challenged allies. You all know the litany of critiques. But on the other hand, it has quite successfully in certain ways cast the die, which has made other countries be more alert and I think actually more responsive to the need to alter course on China policy. The other thing that has been extraordinarily striking to me is even as Trump's ineptness has mixed with a certain artfulness, I've been struck by a policy emanating from Beijing, which I frankly am at a loss to fully able to explain in terms of its own national interest. Namely, why is China roaming the world antagonizing countries that might well be at least neutral and possibly somewhat friendly to it? So if we look around the board, we see quite a remarkable array of missteps that I think have helped Europe and the United States come together despite all of the other missteps. Look at India. We don't need to get into each of these in any detail, but the situation at Aksai Chin has been transformative in India's attitudes towards China. Look at Australia. I mean, this is a country that is largely dependent on China for trade, and yet it is alienated to a degree which I think would have been unimaginable a couple of years ago. Look at Canada, another extremely vanilla and usually very unprovocative country, with Meng Wanshou under house arrest and the whole Huawei dispute boiling up, and 2 Canadian citizens in punitive detention in China. Relations between China and Canada, which was once its sort of champion, have deteriorated grossly. Now we see what's happened in Britain. You all in the UK and Scotland and elsewhere in Europe are much more familiar with the situation than I am. A rather surprising turnaround. You see other countries like Denmark, Sweden, the Czech Republic, Italy, and there are others who have eschewed Huawei. And I believe that Germany may not be far behind. That is going to be a very important switch. So if you look around the world, you see that there has been a remarkable change. And I haven't even mentioned Hong Kong and Taiwan. And we already had a dust up between Korea and China over the THAAD missile system in which South Korea received a lot of punitive response from China. So it seems to me that despite our missteps, despite our ineptness in weaving the fabric of the natural allies in terms of political systems and trade partnerships together. Nonetheless, there is a striking world trend toward viewing China much more skeptically, as much more of a threat that requires much more of a concerted response and a concerted action. Whether we'll actually get something together is very hard to say. I think it probably will depend on what happens in the American election. And whether if Biden gets elected, whether he can begin to bring alliances back together again and have them feel more comfortable with each other and act in concert. But on the other hand, one has to be surprised by what President Trump has managed to do. And as Roddy said, we have Secretary of State Pompeo now in Britain, which was I think a very important switch that just got turned in this whole dynamic. And we'll have to see what happens going forward in terms of Europe itself. But something is afoot here. And I think it is time for natural allies and partners to come together in a more collective and concerted manner to figure out what is an appropriate response to an increasingly belligerent, increasingly aggressive, assertive China. And we don't need to go through the litany of cases from the South China Sea to the East China Sea to Taiwan, Hong Kong, to make that case. So let me stop here, and very interested to hear what my colleagues will have to say.
Well, Orville, thank you. And of course, one of the questions is whether the Chinese are taking note of this chorus from the rest of the world of disapproval. And that is an interesting thing to consider. So thank you very much for that. And Rana, let's now turn to you in Oxford and hear your view of this report.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed, Roddy, and thanks to Orville, first of all, for shepherding this very important report. It was a great privilege to be involved in a quite large and certainly very impressive group of people from across Europe and the US discussing this very important set of issues. And also a great pleasure and privilege to be able to say a couple of minutes worth of consideration of it right now. I won't repeat anything that Orville has said because I think he's laid out the current situation extremely fluently. What I might do is take advantage of the fact that I think I may be the only speaker on this call who's actually in the UK, even though it is a UK-based enterprise, so to speak. And therefore, I think that one of the things that might be worth reflecting on briefly is the UK, not just in and of itself, but as something that I think came up in the context of those discussions on the report, which is what do middle level, important but not global superpower type states like the UK, like Canada, like Australia, do in a world where the US-China trade war and increasingly neo-Cold War is emerging, but when they do not have the resources or the capacity to shift entire orders in the way that either the US or China does. And I'm sorry to say I don't have a magic bullet for that particular problem. What I'm going to do though is suggest 4 areas. This being China, we could have 40, but we don't have the time and that would lose focus. So I'm going to suggest 4 areas which I think in a sense draw on from the kind of problems that Orville has put forward and suggest that for a country like the UK, and for other countries too, there may be some practical ways forward, not just to think about policies in terms of what we can do in the short term, but the kind of mindset and attitude I think we're going to need to have in a world where China will be a very major, important and influential power for some time to come, but where there are many aspects of China's behavior, which as Orville's just pointed out, we in the liberal world find very, very difficult to deal with and, beyond that, robustly disagree with in many cases. So here are the things that I think would be worth thinking about for not just governments, but actually for the public sphere, civil society, media, everything that goes up to make public opinion and discussion. Business, I should have mentioned as well. I'll mention that now in this context, particularly in this institute, of course, which has a lot of business interests. The first one, I don't know if my fellow panelists will agree or not, I still find myself astounded by how woefully low the sheer knowledge level is in the Western world about China. Not just in the Western world. India, another country which I think has huge interests in China, is very under-equipped when it comes to learning about and knowing about China. But even in the UK, we produce, I don't know, a few hundred, I think, graduates in Chinese language from the universities each year. SOAS, one of the great world institutions in this area, is suffering huge financial difficulties at the moment. I know that in Scotland you have not one but two institutions with very important Chinese studies units, the University of Edinburgh and also the University of Glasgow, and I know there's work elsewhere. So for a relatively small country, that's a good concentration, but more than that will be needed. So thinking about how we get, if I may use a good communist word, a cadre of specialists, of experts, of people like Orville and others in this grouping who have spent a lifetime actually learning about what goes on in China and are able to speak about it from a position of some knowledge and expertise. And as I say, not just in academia by any means, but also in government, in business, media and elsewhere. That I think is very, very important indeed. Second is a mindset. One of the things that has dismayed me, regardless of what you think about policies on specific things like Huawei is the obvious example, but there are plenty of others, is the unprepared and in some ways very reactive nature of policy towards China. It seems to me that, a country which 7 months ago announced that it was going to allow Chinese participation for quite a high proportion of the 5G network in the UK, and then reverses that position 7 months later, is not a country which at the moment has a fully strategized way to think about the nature of China. We should be thinking long, we should be thinking deep, and we should also be trying to think at least 2 or 3 steps ahead. Game planning everything to think, well, if we do this, what's then going to happen? At the moment, one of the things we do know, and Orville alluded to this, is that China will react very fast and often in extremely confrontational fashion to any sense that its sense of national interest, but also national dignity is being attacked. And I think that there is a balance between deciding that we need to protect a whole variety of national interests, if that's the right way forward, as it so often is, but also to make sure that our diplomacy and our political savvy about these questions is much more skilled than it often appears to be. The third point, and I think that relates to these other ones, is that we need to actually be understanding in some depth much, much more than we do at the moment about China, what goes on there, what's happening, not just in terms of reading the tea leaves of what top leaders are doing, but actually understanding in particular the emergent urban middle class, their viewpoints, where they're coming from, and how we engage with them. Those of us in the UK probably spend far too much of our time, at least if you're a certain sort of person, reading, US websites about the upcoming election and reading about all sorts of interesting cultural goings on in the guitar clubs of Austin, Texas, or whatever else it might be. We simply don't have, it seems to me, that grouping of people who have that level of perhaps almost obsessive interest in China. Language is, of course, a difficulty, but if we're training more people, that should be something we can overcome. And having people who are as savvy and able to read things like Chinese social media, engage regularly with Chinese interlocutors to just get a sense, the finger in the wind of what's going on, that seems to me severely lacking and very, very urgently needed in all sorts of ways. And then with all that together, my final point would be is that we have to bring these together to work out what the position of all of us needs to be. And first of all, I would say, as the report says, the liberal world, defined broadly speaking, the West, if you want to call it that, but it has also in it Japan and various other non-Western societies, does need, I think, to have a more coordinated sense of what it wants from itself and what it wants from China and what it does accept and what it doesn't accept. And it's perfectly okay, I think, to make those points clear and transparent. But in that, the combination of, I'll use the word engagement. I know that for Orville, the US side of that has really come to an end. I'm not sure we're still quite so convinced in Europe that engagement is totally over, but certainly it does look in some peril at the moment, I think it's fair to say. And trade, but also protection. We're hearing a lot more these days about how we must, on the one hand, make sure that Britain's higher education system is very welcoming to large numbers of Chinese students, not least because of the cultural capital it creates for both sides, but that cannot allow any kind of influence on academic programs or the freedom of students or teachers to study and lecture about what they want. Technology, we need to draw on China's innovative technological developments. At the same time, we clearly mustn't make ourselves vulnerable to the possibility of intellectual property capture or any of those difficulties that come in. And when thinking about opening up new markets, and I still believe that trade is a very, very important part of what we have to offer, the UK as a services economy needs to think much more strategically about where we can offer services but not increase vulnerability. Legal services seems to be one very obvious area where that might well be possible, but there'll be other opportunities. But to conclude, as you see, in a sense, my answer to the questions that the report has put forward, and they're very important questions, is to think not just about very specific policies for this week or next year, but about mindsets which are going to recalibrate us engaging with China, dealing with China, and sometimes having to talk to China in a way that says, actually, we don't accept X, Y, or Z, with proper, deep knowledge and forethought and planning. All right, thanks very much, Roddy.
Rana, thank you. Thank you for your very interesting comments, which are thought-provoking. And Ellison, thank you for joining us from Washington, D.C. And perhaps you'd like to share with us your thoughts on what's said so far and the report.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me this afternoon. Great comments by my colleagues. I want to, I think, begin by commending the organizers for the gathering, the conference that originally sparked this report, and for all of the thoughtful work that's gone into this topic. I think one of the broader themes that I've noticed in this, and this exercise itself, I think, draws on this, is just the need to more actively engage in discourse, in conversation on both sides of the Atlantic about China, sort of a more free-flowing, exchange of views and perspective at all levels. You know, we divide up frequently into track 1, track 1.5, track 2 dialogues. I think never enough, in my view. That's always room for more to really understand what the view is from the other side. To that end, I was pleased to hear Secretary Pompeo accept Borrell's invitation a few weeks ago for this EU-US dialogue on China. We'll wait to see sort of what frame this takes and the level, initial topics for conversation, but I think it's a good sign. Also that, he is in Europe this week. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, is also in Europe this week for talks. So conversation is a good thing. One of the themes also that I picked up in this report that I think is worth highlighting here in a connection to, my colleague spoke to this, is the need for more education and I think broader public discourse on both sides of the Atlantic, not only about the nature of the challenge, but sort of why there's a particular urgency to it. I think it's difficult, as was noted in the report, sometimes to talk about European US views on China, given that there are such different frameworks at the moment. The United States has, I think, very much and for the foreseeable future coalesced around a very geopolitical view of our China policy, seen through, a strategic competitor national security lens. Some of that conversation is coming around in Europe, but by and large, Europeans have been able to compartmentalize in a way, but approach China policy largely through more of a commercial lens. And that, I think that difference in perspective is something that is going to remain for the time being, and something that we'll have to work through. I agree with colleagues that it's been interesting to see in the last few months, I think particularly since COVID, some of the more curious, from a strategic perspective, external actions by the Chinese government and the CCP. I think particularly in Europe, there's been, some discussion, some understanding that, the Beijing may have overplayed its hand a bit, again, in some of these very assertive actions, but also the discourse, the wolf warrior diplomacies we've talked about, even the heavy-handed approach toward COVID aid in many countries across the European continent. I think that has sort of done more to advance some of this public discussion, public discourse of the nature of the China challenge than, you know, all of the public messaging and meetings, private messaging, and sort of government to government messages that have been carried out the last couple of months. So I think that's an important thing, an important piece, an important trend line to continue. And again, it will be interesting to see the continued effect that, or the impact that that response has in Europe. I think we're beginning to see some of that build now, but time will tell sort of how far that turns the needle. There are a couple of things, as colleagues have mentioned, that I think could continue to bring Europe and the United States closer together, that we could work together across the Atlantic on China issues. I do think, as was mentioned, it will continue to be very important to broaden the discussion for the United States and Europe to sort of lead a broader grouping, even informal grouping of like-mindeds. Particularly to glean and, you know, understand even just the experiences that some of these countries have had, Canada, Australia, others, in their dealings with Beijing lately, but also to, you know, lead going forward. I think there are, as was mentioned again, some issues. I agree with my colleague that we have traditionally been very reactive in China policy. I think there are issues on the table, areas of commonality between the US and Europe that would be good fodder to do this exact type of thing, where we start to begin to look 2 and 3 steps out. You know, technology, areas of emerging technology and standard setting being one of those. We, you know, have also started, I believe, to have some more general conversations again about broad topics of governance, and sort of understanding what the United States and Europe might be able to do with a common foundation of sort of liberal democratic norms, shared values, shared understanding of the universality of human rights, sort of to do going forward and push back against you know, China's rising influence in that space. I also think, as was touched upon, the topics of the Communist Party's sort of use and expanding use of disinformation is another sort of emerging area where the US and Europe have a lot to learn from each other, information that can be shared, and sort of start to look 2 and 3 steps down the line. I might stop there because, again, I largely agree with a lot of what my colleagues have said before. Don't want to repeat too much, but I thought this was a fascinating report for the breadth of topics that it covered, and sort of look forward to engaging in more questions, but also diving more deeply into some of the specific topics for discussion.
Alison, thank you very much indeed for your comments. I'd like to just raise a question for, I think, each of the panelists, really, before we to broader Q&A. Perhaps starting with Orville, starting with you, how important is it to differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party and China itself? And is there in fact a unified position really deep down amongst the Chinese Communist Party, or are there signs of fracture?
Well, this is, of course, a endless topic, and I think it's fair to say that, particularly within the leadership of China, it is something of a black box, and we really don't have a tremendously highly evolved notion of where the fracture lines are, the disagreement points are. However, it is, I think, undeniably true that educated people in China, professional people in China, and many sort of urban Chinese do take an increasingly skeptical view of the big leader culture that is developing in China around Xi Jinping. They just were touting this new center of Xi Jinping, thought, which in Chinese, the word 思想 is a word that thought is a word we've almost exclusively associated with Mao Zedong. And now suddenly you have Xi Jinping having thought that is equal to Mao Zedong's, and study centers set up to study his speeches as if he was, Hegel or someone like that, or Marx that had, was worthy of a whole study regimen. So we don't really know what goes on within the leadership, but I do think that there is a lot of incipient dissent within China that, because of the increasingly authoritarian cast of the government, simply cannot express itself. So what I'm assuming is the case is that governments like that become increasingly tightly wound, and they become increasingly brittle, even as they successfully control the situation more comprehensively. But that does make them, I think, ultimately quite unstable. So it's undeniable there's a lot of nationalism aloft in the land, and the party has been leading that. But what the divisions are between the top, the leaders, the Chinese Communist Party, and the so-called people, it's very hard to say with any clarity, except to say that there are fracture points, and there is a gathering sense that something isn't quite right, even as China has been very successful in developing, becoming wealthy, powerful, and throwing its influence around the world.
Thanks. Rana, any comments? I think my voice is a bit patchy. I apologize for that.
I mean, always given, as ever, about as expert a statement as we're going to get from a Westerner. I mean, it's always the old joke about Chinese communist leadership that, you know, those who say don't really know, and those who know aren't telling. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that some of the broader trends that we've seen, including this very strong sense of a much more nationalistic feeling, are real and secular in the sense that they've been developing over time. I think, you know, to go back to your original question about differentiating, say, you know, leadership, people, party, and so forth, I think the trigger moment, or at least one of the trigger moments for the real change, was actually as early as 2008 and the global financial crisis, a point at which many of China's leaders started to say very openly to their American counterparts, you know, we used to think we had to take lessons from you in terms of how to run a country and how to run a system, and now you basically crashed your car. Why are we going to listen to what you have to say? Now, we all know there are all sorts of reasons why actually, A, that's far too simplistic a way to see the division between the two sides. And B, if you look at what China did in 2008, which is basically injecting huge amounts of credit that built some very impressive infrastructure, but has left a very large local government debt burden, which is not particularly popular, I think, with the wider population, then it's not as if China necessarily had some kind of fail-safe answer either that only China would have come up with. In a sense, it was a kind of form of Keynesianism, I guess. But in terms of creating a wider sense, which is shared, at least by many of the middle-class Chinese that I speak to, that while they have all sorts of reservations and even anger at the system, I mean, go back to February this year, and there was a lot of internet anger, which was rapidly being cleaned off by the censors about treatment of the COVID-19 or cover up of the COVID-19 issue, and, you know, bungling in various areas. Nonetheless, the overall feeling that China's government is an entity which in some ways is standing up for China around the world is widespread. When you see all that wolf warrior diplomacy, I think that one of the most notable things is that the people who are doing it, the foreign ministry spokespeople, have these huge social media platforms within China. They've got hundreds of thousands, millions of followers, basically following them up. If you can imagine, you know, supposing the United States had not politicians, but foreign service officers who were essentially running things so that they could get as many tweets as possible, or as many hits as possible, rather than trying to smooth out diplomatic issues. That would explain a great deal, I think, of why actually that wider sense of populist nationalism is feeding into foreign policy in China in ways that I think actually are very, very counterproductive for China itself. And a few, probably quite isolated voices, but a few voices on the Chinese side have been saying that actually this needs to calm down.
Alison, any comments before we switch to Q&A?
No, I think that's right. I smiled, sort of thinking of, you know, having a bigger cadre of U.S. diplomats, foreign service officers, sort of just, you know, tweeting and retweeting even videos, things, as you said, to get hits. It's an interesting approach. I think I'm curious to sort of, again, to my earlier thoughts about understanding sort of different levels and evolving public opinion on some of these things in Europe. I think one thing that will be interesting to see over time is sort of the extent through, survey data and others, the extent to which this is actually resonating at a kind of substantive level, going beyond just the understanding that China is sort of making a very nationalist, aggressive pitch, but whether people across, Europe, across the world are understanding and kind of internalizing, taking these messages on as messages from the state, sort of just going beyond the clickbait factor. So.
Thank you very much indeed. Doug, let me hand over to you. I think you have a clearer communication.
Roddy, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to ask John Dels if he would ask his question first, please.
My question is, what do you think are the psychological drivers of China's increasing assertiveness? Is it a long-term cultural desire for thousands of years for domination, or is it an anger and a desire for retribution for historical injustices, or a fear of something like loss of internal control or external threats, or is it something else?
Well, let me hazard a quick try. That's a very interesting question, because what it does is it raises sort of the psychological dimension of what's going on. And that's not something that policy people generally factor in very successfully. I do think there's a tremendous historical sort of a fueling system that, China, which had this whole ideology built around anti-imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, et cetera, did have this sort of victim culture of humiliation. And it had really made bogeymen out of the notions of the sort of great powers as predators. And I think, psychologically speaking, you could say that having now become a great power, that without quite divining what it is doing, China is enjoying some of the hallmarks of what it had experienced when it was a victim from great powers, that it can now inflict on others as a great power. In other words, dominance. And you not only can expect people to, you can bully them, you can influence them, you can push them, and you can get them to do your bidding. And you can have a few little kind of colonies of your own, like Xinjiang and Tibet. And when you pronounce, people are supposed to jump. It's very striking to me that there are a number of ambassadors now around the world. I think in Australia, where the Chinese ambassador said to the Australians, you're really just gum on the shoes of China. You're a tiny little power, and we can scrub you off anytime we want. You have the ambassador to Sweden. I mean, this is the quintessential neutral country of the world, and yet by kidnapping a Swedish citizen, the Chinese Communist Party has really riled up the Swedes, and the ambassador is insulting the Swedish government. And you've even had the ambassador in the UK say some pretty antagonistic things, very provocative things, to Andrew Marr the other day on the BBC. So I think there is a bit of psychological sort of relief at being able to act like the obverse of what it was that China experienced when it was being preyed upon by a great power. Now it gets to be a great power and dominate over lesser powers. And maybe in some cryptic way, this is quite satisfying.
Orville, thank you very much. Rana, perhaps if you could pick this up, but I've got a question also from Ben Lloyd. He's really talking on a similar subject in terms of the way in which the educated Chinese are showing increasing concern, which was one of the points made about the authoritarian nature of the regime, but also this growing nationalist sense of pride in economic and political rejuvenation. And perhaps you could pick up on that comment too.
Yes, by all means. I mean, excellent question from Ben Lloyd, and also the previous answer, I think, got to some really important long-term issues that need to be dealt with. I think actually Ben's question contains with it what the Chinese themselves would call a maodun, an antagonism or a contradiction, which actually is not necessarily as contradictory as it seems. The idea that you could be worried about the growing sense of authoritarian rule in China, which has certainly become much more hardline and harsh in the last, let's say, 10 years or so. I mean, 10 years ago, just to be clear, China was not some kind of liberal democracy, but, you know, someone like Orville, who of course is a huge expert in journalism on both sides of the Pacific, will know that there were some newspapers like the Nanfangzhou, the Southern News, which produced some real investigative journalism that was of great significance. There was use of social media to really put forward some major social critiques, even movies and so forth. And the vast majority of that is now gone from the internet because it's been clamped down on. So even within an authoritarian system, it is possible, and China shows, to have what David Shambaugh, the political scientist of China, calls soft authoritarianism versus hard authoritarianism. And I think China has moved much more in the last few years towards a hard authoritarianism. But it's worth noting that the norms on which the Chinese Communist Party operates and the population have grown up, been educated, lived, breathed, gone on vacation, all the things that, you know, ordinary Chinese middle class do, have not been the same bases as those of us living in a liberal electoral democracy. So the general complaint amongst many of the middle class Chinese I talk to is not about the fact that there is not the opportunity, say, for you know, free elected choice of leaders. You hear quite a lot of an argument, which I have to say I push back against quite strongly, but you hear it a lot about China as a meritocracy rather than democracy, these sorts of ideas. In that context, I think it becomes much less difficult to understand that when it comes to the day-to-day of what hard authoritarianism means, people getting very annoyed about, or angry even, that the social media is censored or that they are not allowed to read newspapers that have anything interesting in them. But that is not incompatible with this wider sense that nonetheless, in the last few years, China has become this huge economy, the second biggest in the world, that it has actually the capacity, as Orville was saying now, to, you know, take a stand in the world and push its own interests. You know, China can't be pushed around anymore. And both of these things can and do coexist in the minds of what in any other country would be China's voting public. In this case, they don't get to vote, but China's politicians sure as heck do lobby them an awful lot. If they didn't, we wouldn't be seeing those sort of phenomena like the foreign ministry spokespeople orienting their social media feeds, not to really trying to smooth out diplomacy in the wider world, but to please that nationalistic section of the wired Chinese middle class that are all on social media, on their phones the entire time, and really appreciate actually this very strong, assertive, confrontational China that's emerging. I think the mistake would be to believe that there aren't large constituencies that find that element quite attractive, even if, as Orville's pointed out quite rightly, the specifics of the current authoritarian turn often have lots of things that they really don't like at all. They would have both of those at the same time.
Rana, thank you. Ellison, would you like to comment on both of those or either of those last two questions?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I just sort of underscoring, because I was nodding my head along here, that there's so much complexity here, and the messaging element alone. Yes, there are multiple constituencies. There are multiple. The messaging is designed to reach multiple audiences, both internal and external, also covering sort of those multiple constituencies. So as we start to watch and to look at this more assertive activity, and particularly assertive communications, I think that bears keeping in mind that it serves dual purposes for the Communist Party right now. And, you know, again, not to touch upon COVID again, but using the coronavirus as the example, I mean, we saw so much out of the gate, specifically designed to reshape, reinvent the narrative of China's own response to the virus, to an external audience, but also to an internal audience, to shore up sort of, you know, to its people that the authoritarian, regime had this under control and could write the narrative going forward.
Thank you, thank you. We have a question from Tom. Tom, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Cool. Thank you for taking my question. It's regarding China's human rights record. To what extent will the treatment of Uyghur Muslims affect policy towards China going forward? This is following on from the appearance of the Chinese ambassador on British television on Sunday on the Andrew Marr show. He was shown footage he was told to, it was showing footage of Uyghur Muslims put onto trains, and his response, he didn't seem to want to really answer it. So I'm just wondering what the experts thought on that subject. Thank you very much.
Tom, thank you. Orva, would you like to answer that question to start, please?
Sure. You know, I think these human rights questions, and I would include Hong Kong in this, and certainly the Uyghur situation, and we've largely sort of let the Tibetan situation lapse out of a sense of hopelessness of being unable to do anything. The truth is there's very little that we can actually do. You can't send gunboats in to Xinjiang to correct the Uyghur problem, nor would I think we be inclined to do so. But I think we should not overlook the way in which these kinds of abridgments of fundamental universal rights have a profound influence on the question of whether other countries feel comfortable with China and are willing to trust China, whether in commercial contracts, whether in treaties, whether in exchange programs, you name it. So I think what I've seen happening in the last couple years, quite apart from the actual policy disputes and the breakdown of relationships, is a dramatic shift in climate, in just the sense of people's trustfulness towards China's intentions. And I think that had a deep impact in ways that are very hard to account for, quantitatively in the way we ultimately decide to move. And I think here, I watch the Huawei question very, very carefully, because I think Huawei, whether a country accepts Huawei's 5G infrastructure involvement or not, now is a kind of an ecosystem that helps us measure the degree to which, in general, countries have lost trust in China. And this is what I think Xi Jinping does not properly understand, that yes, you can't factor this into any equation, but the effect is nonetheless profound.
Well, thank you. Ellison, perhaps if you've got any perhaps comments on that, please.
I don't know that I can add much or say much better than that. I agree. I think one thing that will be interesting is, again, sort of what that equation could look like. As I agree that the trend is there, that populations sort of worldwide are moving in this direction. We have seen, I think, particularly in the business community, instances where, there's that red line where the talk is there, but there's sort of an inability or, complicated factors that prevent real action, I guess, on the table. So that will be something moving forward that I think is a great topic for future transatlantic conversation and for extending to, again, like-mindeds around the world. I think the report that you all did highlighted sort of the need to reinvent or kind of rethink the strategy for tackling some of these issues. And I think that's sort of what it was getting at, which is to figure out what can be done collectively to move the needle on action, I guess.
Absolutely, yes, thank you. Thank you. Rhonda, I'm just going to hold you, if I may. We've got a final question, I think it will be a final question, from Sunil. If I could ask him to ask the question.
I have a question which is, in short, what is China doing that is so different than any other world power has ever done? And let me just say one or two things to elaborate on that very quickly. For example, United States has been our guru in teaching us how to dominate the rest of the world for the last as many years, at least 100 years of the US century. And particularly in the last 30 years, the US has annihilated half a dozen countries around the world because it didn't suit their purpose. As far as, Sweden, for example, somebody said that it's a epitome of what you call as non-aligned or whatever, whatever the word was used. But Sweden is the third largest producer of arms and exporter of arms to the world. So they're not having a perfect track record anyway. And as far as surveillance goes, it's become a common joke now. It's a household joke when somebody talks something and say, oh, shush, 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 because CIA might be listening to you. So this is like, I mean, what's China doing that's different than any other power? Thank you.
Sunil, thanks for a great question. And obviously time is running out, so I'll give a very short answer and then a slightly longer but short answer. The very short answer is, at some level, nothing. If you think about the way in which empires and large powers have operated over thousands of years, a power rising and seeking to maximize its military, security, economic, trade, and political interests is not at all unusual. But to give the slightly longer version of the answer, and I think the important answer, actually, I think what is important is contrasting it with what you've just mentioned, Sunil, which is the United States. And respectfully, I think I would push back, because although it is true that the United States, as the liberal hegemon of the last 70 or 80 years, has committed towering hypocrisies. Just ask a Chilean in 1973 or a South Vietnamese in 1963, or whatever you want to choose. We all know that the United States, and indeed no other country, has been perfect, as you put it. But I suggest that if you think about what would have happened, say, in 1945, if someone else had decided to set up the world order. In fact, someone else did. It was the Soviet Union. They were very much involved in the process at the time. And what we can broadly call the liberal world emerged from the American side of that equation, actually to the great benefit of China in many ways, which of course has benefited greatly from many of the economic as well as political aspects of American influence in that sense. So I agree with you that in some sense, when we criticize China for all the things it's doing as it rises, maximizing national interest, not supporting liberal ideas, any of these sorts of things, it's partly in contrast with the current hegemon in the shape of the United States. And all I can give you there really, and in the end it's a question of taste, but I hope more than that, is personal preference. If we have to have a choice about a dominant society in the world, one which allows dissent and difficulty and people screaming and shouting and producing, rock and roll and Coca-Cola and all those sorts of things, which may be good or bad or whatever, and lets people at least have some prospect of adapting and changing it to their own needs and desires, is probably better than one that doesn't necessarily recognize the value of those things. In other words, there's a fundamental difference between an illiberal order and a liberal order which frequently commits illiberal acts. And because we have so much of the latter at the moment, this age of populism and the age of President Trump, who I think is deeply anomalous, I think we sometimes confuse the two. We should keep them quite separate in our minds.
Rana, thank you. Ellison, could I ask you if you could perhaps address that last question briefly? Thank you.
Yeah, it was a good answer. It was a comprehensive answer. I'm not sure that I have more to add there. I think there are specific elements of what Rana just described as sort of the, illiberal tendencies that we're seeing with increasing frequency from Beijing, from the Communist Party, starting to see also, sort of a lot of mirroring of Russian behavior on this front too. A lot of it, you get into specific examples, but where things are not benign as they may seem, and sort of done with, the arm of the state in a, covert, coercive, in some cases, corrupt. That's kind of the catchphrase, I think, sometimes to describe some of these behaviors. But when you start looking, individually at the behaviors that are diametrically different. So.
Alison, thank you. Orville, just perhaps if you could pick up on the last question, but also perhaps if you could just give us your thoughts just to finish, just in terms of, obviously you've been an author of the report and we've moved on significantly perhaps in terms of US and European responses since, but I just wondered sort of how optimistic you are for how we might tackle China going forward.
Well, I think, this is a very good question to end on, because I think what it suggests is, you ask, how is China any different than any other country? Big powers have gobbled up the world and to their own ends since time immemorial. I think what's different is precisely what Rana suggests, a different political system and different value system. And those do more than subtly go around with the Belt and Road, go around with China's influence seeking and spreading its, its projects around the world. So finally, what makes this, I think, a particularly alarming historical moment, and this is where I began my remarks as noting an inflection point, is that suddenly what seemed to be a more limited trade war and disagreements maybe about the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and other things like that, has now gathered up a much larger storm system around it that relates to politics, values, and ideology. Now, this isn't exactly the Cold War, but it is hauntingly similar. And it means that we do have something, which I regret to say this, that has the blush of clash of civilizations about it. And that makes it much more difficult to resolve, because it isn't just a question of can we adjust tariffs, can we get the balance of payments worked out? It's something much deeper, much larger, much more ineffable, and much harder to relate to. And finally, this is precisely the weakest point of sort of China's whole construct. Namely, it feels that the West, or that would include Japan, Korea, etc., is out to overturn its authoritarian system of government, regime change. They call it peaceful evolution. Well, are we or aren't we? Very unclear. And this ideological cast to the competition now raises that question in ways which are utterly unanswerable. And that's why I fear we are off in a new dimension here, where it's going to be much more difficult than it was a few years ago to find a rebalanced, kind of a more reciprocal, more balanced playing field on which to compete.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And that's perhaps a sobering thought to finish, perhaps. I'm not sure whether Roddy's able to come online. Are you able to, Roddy, or are you?
I am, but briefly to say thank you to everybody, because I'm aware that there's something wrong with the broadband connection here. But I'd like to thank you, and I know that Doug will expand on that. This has been a very, very interesting session for which I'm deeply grateful.
And if I may continue, well, we obviously had lots more questions, but we're on the hour now, so we should close. But I would really, we're indebted to our panel this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for such a detailed response to our questions, and for laying out that excellent report that Orville, you're an author of. And clearly this afternoon we wanted to really try and touch on, as Ellison mentioned, sort of the actions that the transatlantic should be taking in terms of making changes for China. I think we've touched on some of those, but I think we'll have to watch with interest. But clearly there's a lot going on in the market at the moment in terms of these sorts of policy decisions that need to be taken. But I think we do well to think about some of the advice that Rana offered us in terms of developing this cadre and this mindset and this increased understanding. So I think we've learned some valuable lessons, and our thanks on behalf of everybody watching this afternoon. Thank you to our panel. Thank you very much indeed for sparing your time for us. Thank you very much indeed.